Welcome to 8 with 8, a podcast from Ohio State Support Team 8, where we share what's on our minds and what's in the research from the field of education. Hey everybody, it's Janine Sansasti, Director of SST8. I'm here today with Stephanie Denham, one of our educational consultants. Happy new school year, Steph.
Hey Janine, and to those of you listening, welcome back to another new school year.
This is our first episode of Season 4 of 8 with 8, and for the next 8 episodes, we will be focusing on strategies that school leaders and educators can use to push the reset button and to refocus ourselves around effective strategies for meeting the needs of students with disabilities. Today, we're going to talk about collective responsibility, with an eye toward how that can be particularly impactful as we think about how to best serve diverse learners. So, Steph, when I hear the phrase collective responsibility, it makes me think actually of collective teacher efficacy, which I know many authors and speakers and leaders are focusing on these days. So how are these topics related?
They are definitely related. Collective teacher efficacy is actually a topic we talked about back on podcast season 1. Collective teacher efficacy, by definition, is about the overwhelming power that groups have to impact change when they share the belief in their ability to solve problems and overcome challenges. That's a mouthful, but in education, it's when a group believes that they can positively impact student learning.
Right, and that's the reason that everyone's talking about it, is that collective teacher efficacy has recently risen to the top of the influences in student achievement. So John Hattie, as we know, looked at 250 things, really in researching the answer to that never-ending question, what works best in education? And this one strategy, collective teacher efficacy, has shown to be among the most very powerful in improving student outcomes.
Well, that all sounds amazing, but how do school leaders actually help to cultivate that belief among their staff?
Right, that's the question.
That is the question. So one of the things that schools can do is to create a sense of collective responsibility. Collective responsibility is the result of the commitment of an entire staff to the success of each student, regardless of whether they are on one's current roster or not. That definition is lifted from the newly released book by Smith, Fisher, and Fry called Removing Labels, Grades K through 12, 40 Techniques to Disrupt Negative Expectations about Students in Schools. And if you don't have it, that's really a good one to check out. That book highlights some research showing that when all staff invest in the success of each student achievement does in fact rise. And for students with disabilities, this means making sure that everyone is involved in planning and supporting students with disabilities, even if their title is not an intervention specialist or paraprofessional or related service provider.
You know, this phrase collective responsibility actually makes me think of a school I once worked in. It was a brand new building that had just opened that year, and it had been designed specifically with inclusion in mind, both in the way that they laid out the building and how educators were assigned to teams. And I remember so clearly throughout that whole year, the principal kept using this phrase, all of these students belong to all of us. And that's really what she was getting at, collective responsibility. But, you know, you can't just repeat a catchphrase like all of these students belong to all of us and expect it to magically come true without any additional action. So what can school leaders do to truly create this sense of collective responsibility among their staff?
That Removing Labels book really talks about creating a climate of supportive leadership. And as a principal, this means not only consistently communicating that vision of collective responsibility, but taking time to align the everyday policies and procedures of the building to that vision.
That makes so much sense. You know, we often say that we want our teachers to work together, but have we given them the common planning time that really allows them to do so? You know, have our intervention specialists been trained in the curriculum and instructional resources that the general ed staff are using? I can think of a lot of connections to that.
Absolutely. And for special education, this means joining TBT meetings with grade level colleagues instead of having more of that departmental model and meeting separately. Which brings me to another book I just love. It's called Your Students, My Students, Our Students, Rethinking Equitable and Inclusive Classrooms by Leanne Young.
Ooh, that's a good one. You know, what you were just saying with that book, when we think about collective responsibility as it applies to special education, it really means getting away from that my students, your students mindset and moving toward a team-based model of support.
Right. And sometimes that's called the separate spheres framework. And although I messed up saying that here, separate spheres framework, I just love the visual that creates, because we've already heard that collaboration is key to the success of inclusive classrooms. And so in a team-based model, every decision is a team decision. And those include from which students need the support to who designs the intervention and when those interventions are actually implemented.
So hang on, I want to stop and ponder what you just said for a minute. In a team-based model, every decision is a team decision. That's really powerful. And, it strikes me that many educators aspire to work collaboratively, and they may even think they are, but I'm guessing there's still a lot of that separate spheres thing going on in the interest of just dividing and conquering and just getting work done. So maybe not so much of the team-based model that we aspire to.
So let's stop and consider some of those important decisions we make. Let's break this down a little bit. So we're going to now review some examples of the expert approach versus a team-based approach. And let's start with how we design support for students with disabilities. Does the interventionist design services based on student needs? That would be more of the expert model, even if that support is planned to be implemented in the general education setting. In a team model, the teams design support together based on student needs and the context of the general education setting in mind.
Okay, and then here's an obvious one that kind of extends from that, how we deliver that support to students with disabilities. Is the specialist the one delivering the support? That's more of an expert model. Or is it delivered by a team? Now, this doesn't mean that a specialist can't work one-on-one with a student if we are functioning in a team-based model. What it means is every member of the team has a clear role and responsibility for how they will support that student's unique and individualized learning needs.
And next, we have to think about location. So for students who are spending a majority of the day in general education, when are those individualized goals being supported? In a team-based model, students' individualized goals are supported with instruction and intervention in the general education classroom to the greatest extent possible. So we're only pulling students out to work on the goals when we have tried, and we found that it cannot be done in the general education classroom with a lot of support.
And then that makes me think about how those supports relate to instruction in the general education curriculum. So when we're taking collective responsibility for our students with disabilities, we see, and in a team-based model, we see that almost all students remain in the general education classroom for instruction, and then they receive supplemental instruction. Their intervention does not replace that general education instruction. And Steph, as I think about all of this, we'd be remiss if we didn't say these are not new ideas. I hear echoes of so many things we've talked about over the years, LRE and inclusion and multi-tiered systems of support and emphasis on core curriculum and co-teaching. But what stands out to me today as we talk that's new and important and what can really help us reset and restart this year is that notion of collective responsibility. If we rally around the idea of working together, and even stepping back and assessing how we collaborate well and how we can do better to really ensure that all of these students belong to all of us, I think that's where the true power lies.
Absolutely. So let's help each other out. Here's our call to action for you thinking about collective responsibility. Think about these prompts. What if support for diverse learners in your building or district was done with a team-based approach? What would your TBT meetings look like? What about department meetings? IEP meetings? What would your planning time look like? And finally, what can you do to shift towards a team-based model in your current role?
And that's it for another episode of 8 with 8. Thanks for joining us. We'll post a link to the books that we referenced in this episode, as well as a brief article on collective responsibility that has some really nice tools that can help staff self-reflect and set a course for growth for the year. In the meantime, remember, as we embark upon this new year, no matter what your role in education, you can make a plan to cultivate an environment of collective responsibility. Because when teams of educators believe that they have the ability to make a difference and that everyone on staff has a role in supporting every student in the school, student learning takes off. Join us next week as we think about resetting school climate to kick off the year in a positive and inclusive way. See you soon.